Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. This is Michael Brenton Smith, and I'm with Jim Groom.
Hello there.
And Jim, I want to apply the Jack Butler method. How do you approach podcasting with the Jack Butler method? What does that mean to you?
You grab the mic and you hold on tight, and it will drag you all around the house, maybe.
I mean, you just gotta use your smooth brain as a man and just work your way through it, right? You don't think about it. We're doing Mr. Mom with Michael Keaton, which premiered in 1983. It is yet our third 1983 film.
We're on a roll.
And it was a bit of a surprise. Second film for Michael Keaton. His first film was Night Shift, which he was very successful in, and I think that's what led to this film. Mm-hmm. This is a top 10 film grossing, amazingly. Like, this kind of movie a family drama comedy could actually be a top film back in 1983. And it was even like a workman's kind of director. We have Stanley Dragoti. He only did like two other films. So he did Love at First Bite and Man with One Red Shoe, and which, that was that Tom Hanks film, if you recall.
Both strange films too. I love Love at First Bite, and The Man with One Red Shoe was so weird.
And like a lot of these guys, they came out of advertising, right? He was like a part of the I Love New York campaign, which is kind of hilarious, right?
That's so great and relevant to Mr. Mom, actually.
Yeah, ultimately. And, it was written by John Hughes, our second John Hughes scripted film. Vacation was his first to be successful, and this was his second, which this one really matters because this is what leads John Hughes. This is the real springboard. Absolutely. Right. This is which leads to the deal for him to make 16 Candles, and The Breakfast Club, and what was the
Weird
one with
Science?
Weird Science.
Weird Science.
And but also we're so blessed.
1 second there.
What's that? Go ahead.
1 second, my friend.
Yeah.
He got a $30 million deal in 1983.
Yeah.
To a 3-picture deal for $30 million, which is absurd money. So boom, after this, he did Vacation, which grossed at number 10. Yeah. Mr. Mom was number 9. So he had two insanely well received and well received is mixed, but basically high grossing films. And so they basically locked him in for 3 films.
Especially relative to budget. Right. These
Absolutely.
are really inexpensive films to produce. And it's like, this is a man who can, and he was known at National Lampoons where he was also from advertising. Right. And John Hughes, I can't remember what he was on, some sort of job that led him to New York in his advertising role. And he would allowed him to visit National Lampoons. And then he started writing for them. And they were he was a crazy prolific writer. He could just burn through jokes and just kill it. And so, I guess, it's kind of the equivalent of Shonda Rhimes Netflix deal money now, right? It's you're given a blank check practically to say, we trust you. Your content's it's gonna sing in our studio. And so it was really his beginning, because 16 Candles was a revelation, just 2 years later.
Exactly. And then obviously probably his best film, Breakfast Club. And then, Weird Science, a weird film, but at the same time, you got Chet, the brother, with Bill Paxton, which was worth the price of admission. So but just a really interesting, 1983 was a very good year for John Hughes.
Right. Definitely. And, besides Michael Keaton, we get Terry Garr at peak Terry Garr. And God bless her. She recently passed away this year.
That's right. R.I.P.
And, she was, I think, nominated for Tootsie in her role as the girlfriend to the Dustin Hoffman character. And, she's just, she seems like she's doing nothing, right? She's just, I'm the housewife who converts into this corporate role, but she's just so smooth in her delivery and just, kind of comedic timing is brilliant for someone who's not given a lot typically of an 80s role, but this one is more like her role really, unlike these like films where a woman is often given nothing to do in an 80s mom role. She's playing the man, right? Like quote unquote, the man's work, going back to work.
She's really good. I agree. And there's a film that I do want to do an episode of at some point on this. It's a 1984 film. It's called Firstborn. And Terry Garr, coming off of this, plays yet a very similar suburban mom, but in a completely different context. And it would be very interesting once we've watched this, and if we watch Firstborn, to think back on her role in Mr. Mom and how much it informed her role later on in Firstborn. But yeah, Terry Garr is one of those 80s staples, right? Like just like she and Shelley Long, who I often confused as a kid, were this kind of, rise of a different kind of like female actress star. And Shelley Long and, Terry Garr are definitely part of that kind of new vision of the, kind of working woman actor who's kind of doing the work, who's not just kind of sex appeal like, Christy Brinkley, who shows up for 5 minutes, but like really like acting and doing the kind of, the thespian thing that makes these 80s movies great.
Which is really, if you think about it, that had already been happening in television, right, throughout the 70s, right? You have Mary Tyler Moore Show, and you have Alice, if you recall, like the women in the waitresses in the diner. Flo, right? She was so great. Like, so it had been happening in the television world, but no, it really hadn't been happening much in film yet. And this is kind of the beginning of films like trying to tackle like, hey, wait, we've been short shrifting women in roles. And even though this is still really focused on Michael Keaton's performing the role as the housewife, right? But Terry Garr does get a fair amount to do in this film, and her going to work is a significant point. But being like a sitcom, this film is also filled with like this cornucopia of character actors, right? That you would see, and including like Martin Mull and Ann Gillian, who plays the sexed up single neighbor, the divorcee, Jeffrey Tambor, Christopher Lloyd, who I adored in Taxi as Jim, the like who just had done way too many drugs in the 60s, but was somehow able to get a driver's license and a taxi license.
Yeah, 2 years later would be immortalized in 1985, right? Immortalized as, Back to the Future.
Right. Yeah. It's only 2 years later. But do you remember Jim did you ever watch Taxi?
Reverend Jim is actually where I got my nickname from.
Oh, really?
It's based on him, kind of like spaced out, but like a genius, right? Not that they had anything to do with that. But
so wait, are you saying you did far too many drugs? Is that what you're saying here, Jim?
I'm over that now. It's a new day.
It's a new day. One of my favorite, just as a very quick side of Taxi, so they're trying like hell to reform Jim, all the men and women of the crew in the garage, and they're getting Jim, trying to get him his first taxi license, and he's doing the written exam, and they're helping him from the side, and he's like trying to get, say, hey, question 6, what does a yellow light mean? And so the response from Rieger is, slow down. Jim goes, what does a yellow light mean? I mean, it was that kind of humor. And that kind of humor, this like slapsticky humor, really harkens back to the 50s with the kind of, they were the prototype of the romantic comedy, right? Like the slapstick comedy that Cary Grant is referenced in this movie. So when in one of the finale scenes, when Michael Keaton kicks the television, on the TV is the film with Cary Grant, where he's So I Married a War Bride, and he has to code switch, he has to cross dress because he's a French military man, and he gets to go home with his wife who's in the military under the War Brides Act, and they don't believe that he's truly, deserves that status, so he has to dress as a woman to make it home back to the States, right?
That's awesome. Good work on that.
Yeah, it's so great. So, so much of this film is rooted in, as you said, like the 80s home. And so let's start there, because that's really kind of where the film starts.
Yeah,
How is the 80s home presented?
yeah. Well, this is for me. I know there's questions of family, and I often, mediate a lot of my emotion and feelings through objects. Like I'm one of those, like, castaways of capitalism, if you will. So, what that kind of means is when I watch a movie like this, especially when I'm a kid, but even now, I am watching it through the objects, in the film. And in particular, when you get a film like this, which it starts with the house, and there's always these establishing shots of the
Mm-hmm.
house. And, it's interesting because I think Wes Craven later on in Nightmare on Elm Street does the same thing, but that house is completely, haunted and messed up. Whereas this one, it's kind of a happy house. But then you go up to the two boys' rooms, and the first thing I see that I love is the race car bed. And
Yeah,
if you're a kid of the 80s,
yeah,
there would be those kind of, here's a race car bed you would get in. And I just love that stuff. And then when they're down in the kitchen on the fridge, there's the multicolored, bright letters of the alphabet, which you would
the
have on
magnetic
there
ones.
to
Yeah,
hold your grocery list or hold the note for whoever, or here's the list of what to do to the babysitter. Like those were there. And I just deeply associate with this home. And then the deep brown color palette of the house, like
yep.
everything is in these browns and there's carpet everywhere. And I just love it. Another moment is when you're up in the boys' rooms again later on in the film. There's a poster of the Lions quarterback, Eric Hipple, who was for 10 years the quarterback for the Lions. They weren't amazing, but he had a couple of good seasons. And then he went on to have his own tragedy with his family and stuff like that. But that's an interesting point. But then the family station wagon, right? And there's some
Yep.
great scenes with him riding around. But like all of these elements for me is where I kind of start to dig in on this film. It like really starts to say, oh, I associate with that. I grew up in that, or when I was growing up watching this film, because it was extremely successful comedy. My family and I loved it. Like you see yourself in this film. Like
Right.
this film is so identifiable. Go on
Yeah,
through the house. It's just amazing. You can look at the technology, but we'll talk about that later.
yeah. I mean, I think like it is very contextual too, because when we're going to jump to how, this is a fish out of water story. So Jack Butler is an engineer at a car plant. So it's situated in the Detroit area. It's the 80s, economic crisis. He actually carpools with three other guys that he works with. So to emphasize that point, but he gets fired, right, by Jeffrey Tambor, which is really funny. And it leads to Christopher Lloyd trying to choke him out, and then doing a half-assed effort to try to stop him. And then he makes a bet with his wife moments later as he gets home, and she's playing the dutiful role and prepared the children to stand by him as he walks in and be his shoulder to cry on, right? And but he's a sass, and he immediately bets her that he can find a job faster than Caroline, who's Terry Garr's role. That's her; she's the wife, and of course she succeeds, and that's the MacGuffin, right, of the entire film. Is she's going to go back to work after a couple years? She's got the college degree, I would guess, from Michigan, because she's wearing that shirt, right? And
That's right.
and
And they're in
and
Michigan, and Detroit's
right,
everywhere, so you got to
yeah, yeah.
assume that.
and and so she's got a couple years that she had before they had kids, and so she's going to go to bat. And Ron Richardson is really into bringing her aboard, but as part of that fish out of the water is like when he is immediately thrown into this role, on his first day, she's like rolling through the list, the mommy list of this is how the kids actually work. Like, here's the instruction list for your own children that he never even entertained prior to this moment, right? And one of my favorites, like it's like Kenny, Megan rubs her ears, is the baby. So there are three children. There's Kenny, Alex, who are both like I think 6 and 8, and Megan, who's probably like 1.5,
Yeah.
something like that.
She's running around in that kind of, what do you
And the
call those?
chair,
Yeah.
yeah, the chair with wheels, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Love that.
And And then she makes my favorite notice, because this leads to the home of the 80s. Kenny is fine with the toys basically by himself. Like, basically, this was part of 80s life as a child. You were left
Totally.
alone by your parents. You had maybe video games, but when you were really young, you didn't, right? And
Mhm.
you were expected to entertain yourself. Like, you sit in your room and you'd play with Legos or Tinker Toys, and
Yeah,
no
that's what
one's
she
gonna,
says. She names
yeah,
Tinker Toys, right?
yeah, yeah, and he's fine with his Tinker Toys, and so that, I think, is also part of that, 80s, that home life that was expected of you, as even as a child. You're going to be independent at age 6, right?
Exactly. Don't worry about them. Just a little
Yeah,
one you might have to feed.
right, right, right. And so they're set off, and so that's the MacGuffin. And the great thing is, part of this fish out of water, there's kind of like two early scenes that are really important, and it's wrapped around his grocery shopping and his day of domesticity at the
That's
home.
great.
So tell me about that grocery store experience, and how is it symbolic of that time, as well as like how Michael Keaton's character kind of responds to it.
I mean, grocery stores. I don't know. Like, it is the home of the label, right? It's the home of, like, you see the Tide in this movie, the Tide box, which is just like, an icon of 70s and 80s advertising and product development and design. And you just go from aisle to aisle with kids, and kids are grabbing stuff and pulling stuff in, and it's a free for all. And my mom used to shop, and there were like 6 or 7 of us. And my mom's grandfather, so my great grandfather, started the first supermarket in the United States called King Cullen. And so, like,
Oh,
he was the kind of idea. He wrote to his boss when he worked at A&P in Chicago, and he's like, "Look, we're doing this all wrong. Having people run around and get shit and bring it to the front and stuff. It's like, let's make it like a big warehouse and self-service it." And the guys were like, no, no, poo poo. So he went to Jamaica, Queens in Long Island, and he bought a big warehouse, kind of like what Costco and all them did later on. And he started where, people would come and do their own shopping. They come and they pay at the cashiers, which kind of is our idea of the supermarket still to this day. And so I'm very much like attached to the idea of the supermarket because it's a family. Like, my mom used to always say, remember that your grandfather, my grandfather, your great grandfather started this all. And so, like, there's so much wrong with the supermarket too. Like, on top of just like so much crap food, the way in which they put
oh
these
yeah.
sugar cereals, all the like worst elements in some ways of what we lost. And it's funny, I realize that when I come to Italy, like, so much of it is you do shopping piece by piece. You go to the butcher, you go to the pasticceria, you get your bread. But, like, I love this scene because it's a scene that every kid had gone through with their parents and gone crazy. But then I love, and one of the great lines of the film, and I love it, is he's having such a hard time in there. He's trying to keep the kids. He doesn't know what to do. He's ordering, so, like, cold cuts, and all the women are behind him. And it's like this crazy moment where he's like, I just want cheese. And she's like, what kind of cheese? Cheddar, Feta, what? He's like, okay, no, just meat. And he's like, what kind of meat? Prosciutto, and he just doesn't know what to do. And the final scene, when it goes terribly wrong, the kids are missing. He's taking other people's kids, bringing back kids to people who they're not their kids. But then the final thing is, like, every time he does something, they're like, Irv, clean up in aisle 3, which is something I think, if you've ever been in, like, that happened, they had
Yeah,
that speaker system and they would
right.
announce it. And he'd be like, whatever, he'd go drop something, peas or whatever. Irv, clean up in aisle 5, right? And then finally, something else happens. This happens like 3 or 4 times in the scene. And finally, it's like, Irv, clean up in aisle 7. And then Michael Keaton, and his great comic line in the movie, is like, Irv, I wasn't even in aisle 7. Honest. Or some version of that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just that is one of the scenes, like, 30, I haven't seen the film for 30 years, but then watching it again, like, that scene was iconic. The
Right,
grocery store,
right.
something we all knew, a shared experience. And I think that's another thing that John Hughes did so well. is he always integrated contemporary culture into his films and his scripts so beautifully and so effortlessly. And he was kind of, satirizing the idea of the supermarket, which all of us just took for granted as this is how you shop, this is how you live, and kind of made you see it differently. Even as a kid, when I saw this, 12, 13 years old, it really, I love that idea of the supermarket scene. And obviously, it has personal impact for me as well. But I'm sure anyone does with the supermarket.
Yeah. I think I remember, as a kid having to go to the grocery store with my mom. And the most terrifying thing to me was, we'd have all our stuff. And my mom, she was a classic couponer. She'd have like her Rolodex of coupons, like all laid out and ready to go. And like that was a thing that alone, like a single mom, it's like literally 15 cents off X. That mattered, right? Like how much that mattered. Like the fact that you were slowly but surely piecemealing your way through a Sunday newspaper to try to save $5, right? Which is crazy. But to me, the most terrifying thing was we'd be done. We'd have gone through all the aisles, and there were two things I was always freaked out by. It's like, can you go get this? And I was like, me alone do this? I was just too anxious a kid. I was like, no, please, no, I can't leave your side. And then the other one, which always would happen, and I knew it was coming, and I couldn't stand. I was like having to brace myself for it. Is like we'd get into the line, and there'd be like one or two moms in front of us, and she'd be like, oh, I have one more thing to get. And I'd be alone by the cart in line. I was like terrified of what do you do if it becomes our turn and she's not back,
Exactly.
It's like though we were so independent at the same time, just like those things would still paralyze you like a typical child.
My mom would be smoking cigarettes in line, and then I was always, because that's another thing this film really does well is the cigarette culture.
Oh my God, yeah.
I was always fascinated by the conveyor belt and the way that I would always want to put the little thing that like, this is my property.
Oh,
everything after this is yours.
The little plastic bar that delineated customer to customer.
I just love that, and I love
that still is there, which is amazing.
Absolutely, like some of that still like conveyor belt still there, conveyor belt. But I just love that part because that was the technology that drove it all, and it seemed so sophisticated to me at the time. I loved the supermarket when I was a kid. I thought it was just a free for all kind of endless bounty of crap, because we would buy like so much crap. 7 kids.
Captain Crunch.
Oh, exactly. Apple Jacks, honeycomb. You know what
cereal.
I mean? Like,
oh my God, it was so bad. Hamburger Helper.
And I always say that to my kids here. It's like, you all are missing out on cereal. Like cereal for me was like half of my childhood.
Me too.
Best. I love cereal.
That in the morning cartoon strips, right? Like my bowl of cereal, and I delivered newspapers as a kid. So my labor had already started at 6 a.m. So like I always joke, it's like, I remember, back in the day, and Jim and I have a history in the context of teaching a course together, and we used to make assignments for one another, and one was like, give all the jobs you've had in your whole life, like just like talk out your jobs. And I did mine, and I had 10 jobs by the time I was like 16 already, right? Because that was the thing. It's like your parents making you do all these things. And I had started delivering newspapers when I think I was like 9 years old, and it was the free commercial circular that you just put on every house. And I got paid, I think, 1/4 cent per paper. It was like that, literal child labor here,
Well,
so
I tell you, I know this is going off topic, but I have to stay with you. So we had something similar to that. It was called the Penny Saver. It was just full of coupons, to your point, and it tells you something about the 80s. But my brother had because like you, I had all sorts of jobs when I was a kid. My brother had a newspaper route for the New York Post, because we lived on Long Island and people would get the post delivered. And so he did it. And then when he was like 13 or 12 or whatever, he's like, you do it now.
It gets passed down from my brother did it, and then I'd take over. Yep.
And then some real sleazy guy with like hair would come by, and he'd drop off the newspapers early in the morning, and then he'd come and get the money at the end of the week. So
Yeah.
I was like, I don't really want to do this. And especially when it was cold. So I would not deliver the papers. And I would say to my mom, like, we owe this guy, he's like $6. She's like, what for? I was like, because I never delivered any papers, so I can't go get money. And she was like, this is the worst. Your job is costing me money. So that was pretty funny.
Yeah. So we have our first like real day. So we've gone out of the house, and now we have our day of domesticity in the house, right? Jack's second fish out of the water. Where and this is very John Hughes. Like he just it's slapstick. He just like throws 7 situations together in a single like 5 minutes. We have the washing machine. He literally creates a cocktail of detergent, fabric softener, and even a little like a tabletop cleaning spray, which he stirs up
to make everything
in the
more
washing
efficient.
machine.
And he's an engineer, mind you.
He's an engineer. Yeah. And then the TV repair woman shows up. You got a problem with your horizontal hold?
No, that's the best. Because I still deal with that right now, because I deal with old video games that are all CRT. So that's my favorite thing in this whole movie.
And this is the first of 3 moments where they do something they used to do a lot, and it kind of evokes the monoculture. There's the vacuum cleaner is nicknamed Jaws, and so they literally have the dun dun music, which was licensed. But they do this in 2 other occasions, it evokes we all know this music, right? We all know this other intellectual piece of property that everybody is attached to. And the other one is Chariots of Fire, when he's participating in the company Olympics.
That's
the company like obstacle course competition. And then even finally when he does, which becomes a very important scene, and we're going to talk about it, when he goes back to, he becomes like super mom at home, and they're playing the Flying High Now Rocky music, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so this idea of these movies would borrow other pieces of cultural property was really common back then, because everybody saw all the same things. And I think that's so much of like this home life was part of that monoculture, right? Absolutely. And so we could attach to that.
And you would really go around like singing the Jaws theme or the Rocky theme. Like you can really identify with that, because it was so kind of part of it. Now, the whole idea of the house, which is such a great, kind of basically the house turns against Jack. And it's similar because if you remember Home Alone, that's kind of what happens when he goes down into the basement with the furnace. And the furnace all freaks out, and like everything in the house. Like this kid basically has to learn how to manage the house, which is basically the same idea of Mr. Mom for this adult who's been out of the house and never dealt with it. And it's just kind of taking that and repurposing it for the kid. So Home Alone is really, in many ways, a retelling of Mr. Mom, if you think about it.
Which is obviously, just for those, that is also a John Hughes script. He didn't direct either of these films, but yes, and I think that it's that sensibility that I think for this film back then, I guess I'll speak about this now, is like, I think it was considered a series of cliches by a lot of reviewers, in particular Roger Ebert. He panned the film for being like, oh, this is so overwrought. I know all this stuff about men and women. And I think in some respects, I think he's like, because that's what was in television, right? We're talking about how this film is a reflection of what we're seeing in television at the time very much. And it's like, you got to do something different. And he was like, I think he almost wanted to be like Kramer versus Kramer, which is the famous Dustin Hoffman movie. And there's the famous scene where he's a fish out of water for the first time taking care of a kid, right? And he's doing the French toast by folding it in half and putting it in a cup to soak it in the batter. And he's like, and he starts burning everything and just like swearing and freaking out his son. And that movie is an incredible film. And gosh, if we ever do that one, and that's like divorce week, if we talk about that.
We tried to watch it recently, Antonella and I, and we're like,
Yeah, I know. It's that one is, you have to strap yourself in. So I think in this context, like, he underestimated the value of John Hughes taking these characters and just code switching them, right? Like, it's literally all the lines and all the situations like of men and women in these shows, and he's playing that are the cliches, but he's code switching them, right? It's like, oh, imagine if the man said this, or imagine if the woman did that, right? And because it's so tightly crafted, and I'm gonna hold some of my favorite moments of this, but I think they, to an extent, like just the slapstick nature of it and how important that was for this comedy, and Michael Keaton being so good at doing the slapstick stuff with the kids who are just wonderful in their various roles. Um, so I don't think that review holds up quite at all, especially when you see Home Alone, as you described, just a few years, or I guess about 8 years later, becomes this massive hit, and
Yeah.
it's playing with a lot of the same ideas of slapstick humor just through the eyes of a child rather than an adult man.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, and I like that reading, because one of the things I see when I watched this movie, I think, back when it came out in '83, is, my mom used to have a little placard up in the hallway between our dining room and our kitchen. And the placard said, "A man's work's from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done." And so one of those cheesy little like
Yeah, yeah,
placards. But I think this movie, for me, was a revelation, because it kind of took the work of, the domestic sphere, the work of, often a woman taking care of these kids. It kind of looked at just how insane a job that is, how much it entails, like how much it kind of demands. And I don't think it became valuable until you put a man in that scenario. So there's that
yeah.
question.
That's so screwed up, right?
Yeah, so that's when it becomes valuable. But then there's the other point where, as a kid, you were of the '80s, the kind of breadwinner, the person going out of the house was the real worker, was the real person earning, was the real kind of value add. And, women were often invisible. And I think that goes to points you're making about, it wasn't just about like, another character. It was about actually deconstructing something that had become, almost invisible in our culture, and accepting it. And obviously deconstructing it to the degree Aaron Spelling could in a kind
Right.
of 1983 I want to make money film. So I'm not suggesting that, this is the kind of, film that kind of broke down the barriers of gender in the home space at all. But I think, as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old watching it, it really does jar your sense of what work is when you see that father figure take on the really challenging work of juggling those three kids. Like, I felt dread when I watched this about him walking in to take care of those kids with no real sense of what he was in for. And I could see that with my dad. Like, my dad would come home, right, when he was home, and like he was like useless and like scared and like totally like, I don't, like, you kids just go away, like get out of here, because like it was almost impossible to imagine, in his mind being kind of element of the, 40s and 50s and 60s, this switch that in the 80s is kind of like, I don't know, like not ground zero. I always like to say ground zero because I like to be emphatic, but this is a point like here in '83 with Mr. Mom, where we would come during our adult lives as we went on to actually have kids and be, fathers and have families, where it wasn't such a crazy idea anymore. It was
No.
actually pretty common.
Right. Especially when, obviously the world has changed. Well, there's two big ones. Like, no, obviously, women go to work at a tremendously greater rate now than they did, 40 years ago, which this film is at this point over 40 years, which is wild in and of itself.
Yeah.
And the breadwinner conversation has changed dramatically, but just I think depending on the familial context, there's a lot more shared labor, right? Like, I'm the cook of the house, right?
Mhm.
I cook every meal. I make the kids their lunches. And those are the roles we divide labor. Like, we're each better at different things. I'm more of like the keeping things neat, cleaning stuff
Yeah.
up.
I'm the cleaner too.
Yeah, she does a lot more of the communication still with and arranging of appointments and stuff like that. But you know, it's very different now, and now even in the context of, like, say, post COVID, which is the other lens too, right? Where work from home bleeds into this even more, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea of like, yeah, no, you, even if you weren't doing this before, you're doing this now, right? Like, because I'm on a meeting and I have a 4-year-old who's trying to do, grade school. Actually, that would be more like 8 years old, but whatever. I mean, it's just, it was that was another lens through which people, I think, now look at this and say like, whoa, this doesn't connect anymore because it's so obvious. And we have, you know, dad bods and stay at home dads and guys that just like, this is what is natural and normal these days. But at this time, I think it was really important to really play with this idea in a humorous fashion and not feel like that's dismissing the stakes of this situation, and just because it's not going to the level of drama of Kramer versus Kramer, because we need to be taken through this lightly sometimes and not be hit over the head with how awful this life is, which leads to, and I think this is a good segue into the depression section, right, where Jack lets himself go. Like he can't handle it.
No.
He starts off sprinting, and he's gone through all these difficult situations, but now he starts to coast. Like, I know the norm. Yes, I'm supposed to clean this up, but I don't wanna. Yes, the kids are getting fed, but
I'm doing it with an iron. I'm making grilled cheese.
I made that grilled cheese yesterday, and it's fine now. I need to just heat it up with the iron, right? And I think my favorite part about this section is that he gets hooked on soap operas, in particular, The Young and the Restless, which is probably an incredibly popular soap opera. And there's, in the Victor and Nikki plot, which is a big part. And I didn't know The Young and the Restless, but sorry.
But I got hooked on,
I got hooked on soap operas with my mom for 2 years watching The Guiding Light. And I knew everything about Riva and I should have looked up the family dynamics and everything. And it was like social media of that time. This is a way to like just distract yourself. And you could walk into any moment, because you think about it, this is an hour of television produced for 5 days a week, original programming, fiction. Yeah. That's insane. Like that labor is insane unto itself. And it's just continual. And it was a really funny thing, because it was one of the moments that I think in my life where I was like closest to my mom. Like we shared this thing of The Guiding Light, and we could talk about it at dinner time. It was just really, really weird. But it becomes the exemplar of you've let yourself go, like that. Your life is wrapped around, trashy melodrama.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, General Hospital was the one I kind of, remembered, but I would only stick with like, the cartoon. So that came on, I was out. You only had a couple of options, but there was a time, I don't know if it was like 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock, because I would stay home from school a lot. And, that would come on, and they were on all channels. It'd be like General Hospital or or The Young and the Restless or whatever. And then boom, like that was kind of like time. Okay, I'm going to go up in my room and play until whatever's back on TV gets off, so I can watch TV again. Like
which is true.
Come on at 3.
I mean, you are talking about one of the fantasy child times, right? It was like when you got to stay at home from school, and it was like you got to watch the game shows, right?
Absolutely.
And these are things that they existed only during the day, exactly. Right? Like they did not exist on the weekends. They did not exist in reruns. So if you were like wanted to see The Price is Right, you only got to see it during like February vacation or something like that. And I remember being like, I'm watching The Price is Right every fucking day, because this is the best thing ever. Yeah. Or the match game. Oh, which, speaking of one of the woman who is the deli woman, she is Patty Deutsch, who was one of the match game regulars, like one of these like game show regulars. And Edie McClurg, who was the cash register woman, she was another one of these types that was
she was in Ferris. She was in
she was the secretary of Ferris Bueller.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but anyway, like that era of that television, just that being able to escape as a kid.
And your point though about it being like social media is super interesting, because like that is what filled the day. And again, my mom didn't care, and I don't think my mom was a big soap opera person, because she would be on the phone all day with a cigarette and coffee. And that's all she would do. She would call people, and they would just talk for hours, smoking endless cigarettes. And like that was it. And go get your devil dogs and then get out of here and then go watch your thing. Like, but it was just purely like that home, but just my mom on the phone smoking, and then the TV was where we would go, and we just spend the whole day. And whether we went to school or not wasn't a big deal.
and it kind of culminates with him. He's literally playing poker with all the single moms and divorcees, right? With coupons are the stakes, and Caroline comes home, the Terry Garr character, and they finally get into a fight, the first fight, and she just rails him, right? And literally pulls this Orson Welles fat joke, which is awesome. And which, now no one's like, who the hell, what does that even mean? But Orson Welles, obviously famous filmmaker who just became incredibly big. And he does and this is the beginning of these examples of where he uses lines that John Hughes has written for him that are straight out of, these are the kind of things women would say in their roles of housers, like, my brain is like oatmeal, and suddenly it means something more. And she is being insensitive, right? As the man of the house, as the breadwinner. It's like, oh, come on, you've let yourself go. You're fat. I did it with pride, but that's the flip. It's like she did it, but she's like, I've got my work to do. Like, you got to get a hold of yourself.
Exactly. Right? And the beard, the whole idea of you need to shave your beard. So here's where my mind goes at that scene. So obviously he's smoking the cigar, and they're all trading coupons in the poker and the coupon poker. But the kids are all in front of the TV.
Right.
So there's that separation. And so all the people are over, so all their kids are there. But you'll notice, if you look closely, that's an Atari 5200 console, which came out that year. And so they're sitting there playing Atari 5200. And I'm thinking to myself, like, that's another moment in a John Hughes film. Like in Vacation, they had him planning his vacation and then Pac-Man eating the vacation. And here there's a kind of classic Atari 5200, which just one of my favorite consoles, even though it was terrible in some ways. And then I just loved the decoration of the house, the details of the house, which for me is what makes the movie believable as a 12-year-old kid.
Yeah, it's not perfect at all. Like it's lived in, which is lovely, right? Yeah. It's like there's their stuff in there. It's not this crafted presentation house, right? Which I think showed up in the 90s, like the McMansions and whatnot.
Absolutely. Even those Will Ferrell movies.
Lived in home.
About families. Will Ferrell movies about families. Like when him and Marky Mark are kind of vying for the family, because I watch a lot of those. They're interesting, but the houses are perfect. There's nothing wrong with them. They're all like multi-million dollar mansions. And this is just like a house you could have lived in.
Yeah. Which leads to, after this, he comes to his senses. And this is another one that I think is a very, very important moment, because not only does Jack get his shit together, but it's also about he's playing the perfect wife, right? Exactly. That's how I see this. He's doing all the little chores. He's starting to, paint the picket fence. He's tamed the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner. He becomes no longer playing poker. He's getting the women of the neighborhood to do some aerobics with him. And he's even super supportive of Caroline now, right? Getting her, and it's he's playing the perfect wife. And it culminates with this beautiful meal he's making for her. The kids are asleep. Caroline's going to come home. We're going to have this lovely dinner. The candles are set. He literally adjusts the place settings, right? And it's this incredible meal. And of course she doesn't show, but he just leaves a note. Honey, I know you've been working hard, and he goes to bed, but she stays up to keep working. And he finally comes down and says honey, you've got to go to bed. Right. And this leads to the final fantasy of the perfect wife. He's like up for sex still, right? Like it's the middle, and like this is what's so crazy. And he literally leads with a line where where Terry Garr gets to say right before this moment, it's like, oh, you're doing a really great job with the kids, honey, right? That's her line for him, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, this is John Hughes doing this incredible job of pointing out of how ridiculous this fantasy is, right? Instead of seeing it as a cliche, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's pointing out like this is not possible by showing a man doing it. Oh, it's possible, but it's not. It's insane.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I like that. I do. I like that reading a lot. And I think it's interesting because Aaron Spelling was a TV producer. Originally, when they wrote this was going to be a TV special, right? So it was going to be a TV movie. But the idea of making it a film in Hollywood, and it obviously does ridiculously successful against a $5 million budget. I think it makes like 60 million. So
64.
it was a huge, huge success. But I like the idea. Rather than panning it, I do think that John Hughes, and part of what I think makes John Hughes so successful in the 80s is his ability to kind of not only poke fun at characters, but poke fun at some of the ways we're living our life in the 80s, right? He was a contemporary critic. And I think one of the things I see this is like, you talked about it at the beginning. They're in Detroit. He's an engineer. He gets furloughed by a big Detroit car company, right? And then he has to go home, and that's exactly where things happen. Like you said, she goes to work for an advertising firm, and he stays home with the kids. But the fact that the layoffs were happening in Detroit, right? Like all of these engineers were losing their jobs was real. Like that was a real American reality. It led to things like, all of these Japanese cars coming in. It led to a very anti-Japanese sentiment in the 80s around like they're taking all our jobs or all of our work is going out over to them, right? Like there was this kind of sense, and he taps into it very comically, but at the same time, like there is a real sense of zeitgeist, not only in the objects in the house, but in the situation of the characters, right? You can feel that she goes to work for an advertising company, and what are they doing? They're selling things to housewives. And so she is in this reverse role, to your point, where she's the one who they're asking, what would you do? Like, how would you approach this? And rather than giving the kind of, she even talks about the canned answers she would give. But in the end, she says, it's a madhouse out there. Everyone's screwing us, kind of how we feel right now with inflation, right?
Yeah.
Cut prices and be honest, right? And it's such a kind of cool moment where it puts you back to that kind of inflation era of the 80s. Like my parents had an interest rate of like 16% on their house in the 80s. Like 80s was rough inflation wise. And I love the way that he's dealing with those realities that you would hear about as a kid in your house. Inflation, right? Things are too expensive. Coupons are important. You talked about it as well. Like all of these things make up a fabric that this movie is touching on a nerve, right? And I love when films do this. They really tap into the zeitgeist and you see a sense of your world in them. And while there's some make-believe and some magic and some nonsense, there is a foundation there that makes it somewhat imaginable, right? And somewhat relatable. And in the end, I think it makes that deconstruction you're talking about that much more powerful.
Yeah. And I think we haven't really spoken much about Terry Garr's work, and her work is really important in this story, right? We haven't mentioned much about the Martin Mull, Ron Richardson, son of a, and oh God, what does Jack say? It's like he's basically just a nepo baby. Like he's gotten his money through his family, right? And so he's muddling his way through a company that his grandfather built, and he even hosts this competition get together work family event in his backyard of this beautiful house that he didn't build. It's his grandfather's. And that's the beginning. This is another point out. It's like the beginning of this forced merging of work life and home life, right?
Yeah.
Like this is supposed to be natural because your work is your family. That, remember, that messaging began around this era, right? Like, and this is something that we were fed and kind of, I'll be honest, like, you believe it's like, oh, if you do a job that you love and you're with these people that you love, then that's all that matters. As long as but in reality, it was not any different. It was part of a messaging of, if you don't have a real family out of the 80s where you had divorced parents and estranged family members, come get your family out of your job, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the beginning of the representation of that, right? Of where Ron Richardson is, though you have to let him win, you have to like let the boss be the best, but you're still a family. And Terry Garr is still a pivotal character in that company and brings back Schooner Tuner to the table, the company that this advertising agency was founded on, right?
That's right.
And it's the beginning of the finale where she has to do a real travel trip for work, and Jack guilt trips her, right? And that's that classic, again, the role reversal going on, and he knows what he's doing in making this do this. And Terry Garr just effing kills it in her delivery and being forced to play the role of the person who's like, what, you don't want me to succeed, right? And that's what's so great, is like there is the nod to a little bit of the woman's perspective of labor, right? And like she's still going to be emotional about where the dad character, if it was a man saying this, he wouldn't say that. He'd be like, I've got to make the money, and be like, fuck you, I'm out of here, right?
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
It's like you take care of the don't put this shit on me, lady, you know?
Yeah, listen, you.
yeah. So and there's this one other moment where, you know, and it's the scene where Martin Mull like tries to seduce her. But for a brief moment we see, and this is emblematic because this is something that is, my wife has a fairly stressful job. And when she's alone, because I do all the cooking, right? So when I have to go somewhere, and I've traveled very rarely, what happens, she's like, oh my God, what the hell am I going to feed the kids? And then what happens for herself when she travels, she just is like, she doesn't feed herself that well. And so the running joke is like, for dinner, she has like ice cream and a beer, right? And that's exactly what Terry Garr does. She's like, I am so excited. And this is the other thing. He nails it. She's so happy to just be alone, right? In the difference of like how a man would respond to a woman respond is very great here. She just wants to be alone. She has her bath. She has her milkshake. And that's all she needs. Meanwhile, Jack is playing the guys' night out party, right? But it's with the housewives, right?
Exactly.
He's going out drinking in strip clubs, but they're male strip clubs, right? And so he's still attentive to what the men want versus what the women want in this kind of scenario, which is, I just kind of love that he figured that out.
And it is a great, though. I didn't even think like his night out versus her night out. Even though she's kind of playing the male role of breadwinner, puts her in a very kind of, you know, and that's kind of weird too, because there's those scenes where she'll be on the corporate jet and they'll be eating steak and she'll be cutting his steak.
Yeah.
Right.
Or like she'll be mess in the office.
Like, there is that moment where the old habits, as she says, die hard. Right. And there's kind of also like, you know, Antonella was like, why is she cutting his steak? I'm like, because she's been cutting the steak of the kids, you know,
and Jack as well, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you know, and for Antonella, it was kind of weird because this movie didn't resonate with her at all. Like, and she doesn't like high school movies. She doesn't like John Hughes in general, right? Vacation, she tolerated, right? But like for her, like, I think she was, you know, comes from obviously a very different cultural milieu where we would like dig on, you know, the whole idea of the house or the grocery store or the drop off, right?
That whole great thing. Yeah. You're doing it wrong.
You're doing it wrong, moron.
Moron. Southside moron. That's the best. With a mom just totally tease off on him, which is so true. Like the stakes that parents take with situations like, with their where their kids are involved. I mean, the epitome of that, of course, is like kids sports, right?
Oh yeah.
The parents yelling at refs and like, what do you mean she fouled, blah blah blah, she was totally in the right, like, and that is a glimpse of a near future too,
Yeah.
right? Of like, I mean, the
Exactly.
Bad News Bears, I think, emblem is the we have to do the Bad News Bears, even though it's another like the family that you make moment,
Yeah. The broken
where
family. Yeah.
yeah, where there's a drunk man who's like the parent of a bunch of kids, teaching them to play baseball. But that's another story.
That is a good one. I agree.
But this idea of the parents overreacting, because they're, and it's a mom, and so it's not to knock on the mom for overreacting. It's just like these are the stakes that they are allowed to care about, right? And
Yeah.
so of course it means a lot, right? And so, and when you're not careful, like, it's offensive. And so obviously she's extreme in her response to the offense, but that's part of how these people exist, where they're compelled to put all of their eggs in this emotional basket of domestic life.
Yeah, and you brought it up already, and I kind of one of the things that, in retrospect, watching this film recently made me think of is like, you know, a lot of people recently when COVID hit, and some of these assumptions, maybe it wasn't as gender kind of codified as it was in '83. But this whole idea of like, what the hell am I doing at my job? Like, maybe my job is not the end all. Maybe it's not the family I didn't have. Maybe it's not like, maybe I need to come back home, right? And not spend half my life commuting or not spend half my life doing something for this jackass boss, right? Not all the things that Jack and Caroline are going through. And it's funny as the film kind of wraps up, one of the things that happens is Caroline, kind of not even in the negotiating stage, negotiates for 2 days work from home, which
Right.
the whole idea of work from home in the '80s was like,
Yeah.
what? Like, work from home? Like, does that mean your dad doesn't have a job? And that's what he's saying to the other people in the neighborhood. So people think he's, not unemployed. Like, this whole idea that she would kind of not only have so successful that she could work from home, because that would be a huge mark of success if you could that. But like this whole idea that, it was presaging a moment like came recently because of a global pandemic where people started to rethink a lot of the kind of like conditions under which they try and do something as taxing and labor intensive as raising a family, right? Like that's the whole thing, and it's the unwinnable kind of condition, for women when it's idea of career or family, right? Like, what are you going to do? Which road, red or green pill and or blue pill, and like, are you going to change that? And obviously, things have changed a little, but it's still a kind of ridiculous kind of charge to kind of suggest that once you have a child in a way that a woman would have that I don't think a man can ever truly understand, right? Because that condition, like, then it's like, okay, off to work with you. Other people
Yeah.
will take care of this little one
Well, I
while
mean,
you
and also
do it.
the
Crazy.
difficulty of managing pregnancy and
Absolutely.
just after labor and that time off. You know, that's such a huge tax on the company, you taking those 12 weeks,
Yeah.
and it's so America where it's not guaranteed. And, and you have other countries, European countries where literally it's parental leave regardless, right? It's assumed that both men and women will take time off. And yeah, I mean, it's so it wraps up super quickly in a sitcom-y sort of way, with Jeffrey Tambor shows up and Michael Keaton knocks him out for like
Yeah.
messing with his kids. I warned you, and the kid's like, "Woo, Dad, one punch," like,
Yeah,
impressive,
exactly.
But he's still like giving him a company car and letting him rehire his friends, and it's all wrapped up neat and nicely. But it doesn't matter at this point. That's not the end. Is not what this film is about
No.
at all. And I think the the slapstick nature of it belies how much interrogation is going on, and I think ultimately that's what I appreciated in this rewatch of Mr. Mom more than anything.
Yeah, and I like that. I think the film ultimately, while I agree with that, the film ultimately can't deal with like, you know, really, despite Terry Garr's amazingness, is it still not an unwinnable battle for women in this situation, right? And is the man kind of slumming, quote unquote, as a um, you know uh, domestic worker in that regard, right? Like he still kind of ultimately can leave, right? He's staying there for the moment, right? But
Yeah.
ultimately he's going to go back to work, and you don't get the sense really like things are going to change dramatically, right?
No.
On a kind of, cultural or base, but, we see it change regardless. But I think that's one of the things that the film comes up against. And I don't think
Yeah.
it's pretending to be able to deal with more of that. But like, this is an issue, right? Whether or not things have gotten better, or maybe we've seen like this is still an issue that haunts, the nuclear family in the US in particular, because, like you said, there are no safety nets. There are no conditions where people can actually take off and concentrate on something else other than work and be able to feed their family. Right? Like it's just it's a deal with the devil, right? And it gets
Right.
worse and worse every year, it seems, rather than better. So, it's interesting. There are some things in this film that kind of open up there, but it's almost sad if you look at it from 83 to 2024, that like that core, how would you say, uncertainty and that core kind of strike, because it gets strange, right? He's been let go. He's been furloughed. And like, there's not that devastation like, oh shit, we live paycheck to paycheck. How are we going to survive? Right? It's kind of
Right.
like, oh, I'll go out and I'll get a
He's not Ben
job maybe.
Affleck and getting a construction dad with it, getting a construction job with his father-in-law,
Yeah, like there's
played by Kevin Costner, who's like turned into a surly conservative bastard. Wait,
so
that's him in real life too.
so there is that point that you really can't relate to, right? Like there is that idea of the kind of
Yeah.
Hollywood, and John Hughes always deals with this always sense of, there is a sense of affluence always with the
Uh-huh.
people and the main people he's dealing with. Um,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like I do like the fact that while it can't answer the question or solve the problem, it really does, for a viewer like me, say back in the day, point out the fact that, oh yeah, the labor that's being asked of the, stay-at-home mom is ridiculous. And
Right.
it's just a crazy kind of, situation we're putting these people in, and not exactly, ever recognizing it. And then once it's on, the kids grow up, it's like, now what are you going to do? Right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's a kind of interesting point for me. And it kind of stayed with me, even as I started my own family. And then this was a definite struggle that emerged in our relationship, right? Like it was real. Like this did not go anywhere. This is a kind of a super, super kind of relatable and still as complicated as it was then. In some ways, I don't know if I would say maybe more, but I would say while different, still as complicated.
Well, it's still complicated because this podcast was recorded just a few days after Thanksgiving, and immediately I have to, after this, do my domestic chores, and there's a bed right here that is supposed to be a couch, and there's a lot of cleaning up still to do because we didn't quite get it all done. So Jim Groom, thanks again for that. This is episode 3. I think we're off to a raging start. I don't know what we're doing next, but I'm looking forward to it.
All right. I don't know next either, but whatever it is, we're gonna kill it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.